Picture this. You're standing on the edge of the Florida Everglades. The air is thick, humid, practically vibrating with the sound of insects.
Oh, yeah. Really sets a mood.
Right. And rising out of the sawgrass and the twisted roots is this rusted water tower. The paint is peeling, just flaking away under the brutal sun, but you can still make out the faded, hand-painted letters.
San Aurelio.
Exactly, San Aurelio. And beneath that tower, there are the burned-out skeletal remains of a church steeple and a few moss-covered stone walls just leaning at these dangerous angles.
It feels like an ancient ruin.
It really does look like one. But it was actually destroyed just a few years ago, and it was destroyed by the very government sworn to protect it. So, today on the Deep Dive, we're getting into the files of San Aurelio to figure out how a group of people trading, tomatoes for silver quarters in a swamp became classified as an existential national security threat.
It is a really striking visual to start with. But, the physical ruins only tell a fraction of the story here.
For sure.
The source material we're examining today is just this exhaustive, meticulously compiled investigative account. We're looking at a vast repository of reconstructed diaries, encrypted private chat logs, trial transcripts, and these heavily redacted, declassified FOIA documents from multiple federal agencies.
The FOIA documents are wild, honestly.
They really are. And what emerges from all this data is not just some simple story of, homesteaders versus the government. It's a profound, high-stakes collision between radical independence and state authority.
Yeah.
This community engineered a fully parallel economic and legal structure right under the nose of the local government, fundamentally challenging the state's monopoly on power.
Okay, let's unpack this, because we aren't just looking at the timeline of an off-grid town. We're going to dissect the underlying philosophy that drove its founders, specifically this mind-bending, mathematically rigid theory of civilizational collapse.
Oh, Jack theory.
Right, the theory that motivated the town's most eccentric architect. So we're going to evaluate the actual systemic risks of modern society, comparing our current vulnerabilities to the structural failures of the Bronze Age, the Roman Empire, and the Maya.
Which is a fascinating comparison, by the way.
Totally. And ultimately, we're going to look at the government's internal playbook for neutralizing communities that prove you don't actually need the state to survive.
So, to understand how a community reaches the point of completely severing ties with the modern fiat system, we really have to examine the specific catalysts that drove its founders.
Yeah, who are these people, really?
Well, a critical through line in the source material is that these architects of exile were not your stereotypical fringe radicals anticipating some sudden cinematic apocalypse.
Right, they weren't like bunker builders.
Exactly. They were highly capable, grounded professionals operating within the system until they were individually broken by very precise systemic failures. They weren't seeking chaos. They were desperately seeking accountability in a system that had just, abstracted it away.
Let's look at the mechanics of that disillusionment, starting with Sarah Whitfield, because she's really the logistical seed of the entire San Aurelio movement.
She is, yeah.
As we said, she wasn't building bunkers. She was a farmer in Virginia operating a totally legal agricultural business, growing heirloom tomatoes, selling raw milk. But she was systematically crushed by the weaponization of local zoning bureaucracy.
It's a very common story, unfortunately.
It really is. The source details how her operation wasn't shut down for public safety or anything, but through this endless war of administrative attrition. Inspectors cited these incredibly obscure environmental regulations, imposing fines that just compounded daily.
Right, death by paperwork.
Exactly. When she couldn't navigate the labyrinth of appeals, they physically bulldozed her greenhouses. From her perspective, her business failed simply because she lacked the capital to out-litigate the state. She didn't grease the right municipal palms.
Sarah's experience is a textbook example of administrative coercion. The process itself is the punishment. And you see a parallel disillusionment in Ethan, who provided the community's tactical discipline.
Ethan's background is so interesting.
It is. He was an 18-year Army infantry veteran. He executed his orders faithfully across multiple deployments. But the text highlights a profound ideological fracture during his later tours.
What happened?
He realized he was no longer securing strategic military objectives. He was just securing logistics routes for private defense contractors.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. He watched the mechanism of cost-plus contracting basically guarantee profits for corporations, while the actual operators, his team, assumed all the physical risk.
That's incredibly dark.
For Ethan, the military-industrial complex was no longer an instrument of national defense. It was a self-sustaining organism, engineered solely to protect its own profit margins. The machine, as he put it, takes care of itself, not the people feeding it.
That exact sentiment, the realization that the centralized apparatus is just entirely self-serving, is mirrored perfectly in Gabriel Martinez, or Gabo.
Cabo, right?
Yeah, Gabo was a Cuban immigrant who grew up in Matanzas and worked in the heavily controlled resort strips of Varadero. So he had a front row seat to the ultimate hypocrisy of his centrally planned state.
Which is very different from the American bureaucratic experience, but leads to the exact same conclusion.
Exactly. He watched party elites coordinate the distribution of imported luxury goods for themselves, while ordinary citizens had to navigate these draconian rationing systems just to acquire basic staples.
Wow.
Gabo understood early on what state coercion looks like when the ideological mask slips and only raw power remains. He knew that centralized control, no matter the political branding, ultimately serves the administrators, not the administered.
Which brings us to Daniel Herrera. He provided the ideological, almost spiritual framework for San Aurelio.
He was the preacher, right?
Right? A former construction boss turned preacher. His foundational break with institutional authority occurred 15 years prior to San Aurelio, following a catastrophic failure.
Oh, the housing project.
Yeah. A municipal housing project constructed by his family's company collapsed, and it permanently paralyzed a resident.
God, that's awful.
It was. And the underlying cause wasn't a mystery to Daniel. It was a lethal combination of subpar materials mandated by budget cuts, municipal bribes, and city inspectors deliberately overlooking structural flaws.
And according to the text, what really shattered Daniel wasn't just the collapse itself, but the institutional cover-up that followed, right?
Precisely. The city quietly buried the investigations to protect the politicians involved, and the local clergy publicly blessed the very officials who signed off on the corrupt deals.
That's infuriating.
That was the exact moment his faith in any hierarchical institution, secular or religious, just completely fractured. It led him to develop what the source text refers to as his libertarian theology.
Okay, break that down for us.
In Daniel's framework, the state is the ultimate coercive tempter. It demands compliance through the monopoly of violence, whereas voluntary, uncoerced exchange between individuals is elevated to the level of true moral order.
Finally, we have to look at Marcus Lee, the Silicon Valley prodigy who engineered their digital evasion.
Marcus is such a key player here.
He really is. He was barely in his 20s, highly sought after for his expertise in cryptography and open source privacy tools. But he defected from the tech industry after watching the tools he helped pioneer get subverted into architecture for mass surveillance.
Right. He understood digital attack surfaces better than anyone.
Exactly. He realized that centralized digital systems are inherently vulnerable. They either fail catastrophically during a crisis due to systemic fragility, or they're actively weaponized against the user by the administrators.
So Marcus recognized that true privacy and autonomy were basically impossible within a centralized digital infrastructure.
Right. Think about it. Have you ever actually read the terms of service on your banking app?
I mean, nobody really reads those.
Exactly. But if you do, you realize that in a crisis, you don't actually own your money. You are just an unsecured creditor with zero leverage.
Which is a terrifying realization.
It is. And if you understand that, then you understand exactly what drove these founders to the Everglades. They all hit a wall where they realized the social contract was fundamentally broken. I mean, it's like renting an apartment where the landlord keeps breaking the pipes, hiking the rent, and reading your mail.
Yeah, eventually you don't just ask for a new landlord.
Right, you go to the woods and build your own cabin. You step outside the jurisdiction entirely. But the catalyst that actually forged these disillusioned professionals into a cohesive, radical community was a man named Jack Doyle.
Oh, Jack.
Yeah, Jack. He is the provocateur, the wild card, and the architect of this cyclical theory of history that defined San Aurelio's entire operational doctrine. So let's really focus the analysis here, because Jack's theory is central to this whole deep dive.
Jack Doyle is a critical figure to analyze, because he really straddles the line between visionary historian and abrasive conspiracist.
Yeah, the sources paint a very complicated picture of him.
They do. The source text dedicates significant space to his grand theory of history, which posits that civilizational collapse is not random.
Wait, not random at all.
Not to Jack. He believed it operates on a strict, mathematically predictable cycle of roughly 1,655 years.
Okay, let's break down the mechanics of Jack's 1655-year math, because he anchors it to very specific historical epochs.
He does.
According to Jack, you start with the late Bronze Age collapse, which historians broadly place around 1180 BC.
Right.
You add 1655 years to that, and you arrive at 475 AD, which conveniently aligns with the traditional dating for the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 AD.
Exactly.
Then you add another 655 years to that, and you hit the year 2130 AD. So according to Jack Doyle's absolute conviction, 2130 is the chronological destination for our next inevitable systemic civilizational crash.
And Jack argued vehemently that we are already deep within the decline phase of this current cycle.
So it's not just a switch that flips in 2130.
No, not at all. He didn't just rely on the math. He outlined 4 specific mechanistic drivers that he claimed guarantee this collapse.
What's the first one?
The first is hyperspecialization. Jack argued that as societies grow incredibly complex, labor divides to an extreme, almost absurd degree. The population entirely loses general survival skills.
Like city boys in the wilderness.
Exactly.
Ugh.
He posited that the vast majority of the modern workforce people whose entire skill set revolves around digital administration or hyper-niche service roles would simply perish in the event of a logistical disruption. They literally cannot generate their own calories or secure clean water.
The second driver he identified is systemic fragility.
Right.
This is the idea that as global supply chains and digital networks become more intricate and tightly coupled, they become inherently vulnerable to black swan events.
Yes.
A disruption in one node doesn't just isolate that node, right? It creates a cascading domino effect across the entire system.
Which brings us to Jack's third driver, the emergence of what he bluntly termed the parasite class.
Oh boy, that's aggressive phrasing.
Very. He defined this as a sprawling, bureaucratic welfare state that extracts resources from the productive class to support both itself and an underclass, serving primarily to maintain the political power of the elites.
And the fourth driver, which was the core of his animosity towards central banks, is the elite feedback loop.
This is a really crucial part of his theory.
Jack theorized that as the decline accelerates, elite supranational organizations, he frequently targeted the World Economic Forum, the IMF, and central banks, will attempt to fix the systemic rot through increased centralized control.
Right, market manipulation, printing fiat currency.
Exactly. And in Jack's view, these desperate interventions are exactly what trigger the final catastrophic failure. By trying to engineer a soft landing, they hyperinflate the currency, destroy market price discovery, and shatter whatever remaining trust people have in the system.
So let's really test the integrity of Jack's historical parallels, because this is where it gets fascinating from a historical perspective.
Let's do it.
If we look at his first anchor, the late Bronze Age collapse around 1180 BC, the historical record actually provides massive support for his concept of systemic fragility.
Really? How so?
Well, we aren't talking about isolated tribes here. The Mediterranean during the Bronze Age was a highly interconnected, globalized economy for its time. You had the Mycenaeans, the Hittites, the Egyptians. They all relied on incredibly complex, fragile supply chains.
Like trade routes and stuff?
Yes. To make bronze, for example, you need copper, mostly coming from Cyprus, and tin, which had to be transported across vast trade routes from regions as far away as modern-day Afghanistan.
That is wild. I always forget how globalized the ancient world actually was.
It was incredibly globalized. And when a confluence of black swan events hit that region, we're talking prolonged droughts, seismic activity, and the sudden violent migrations of mysterious sea peoples, the entire palatial economic system shattered.
Just couldn't handle the shock.
Exactly. The empires were too hyper-specialized in their palace-driven, centralized redistribution economies. The loss of a few key trade routes and agricultural centers triggered a systems collapse that literally plunged the region into a centuries-long dark age.
That maps perfectly onto modern concerns, honestly. Like, think about semiconductor supply chains heavily concentrated in Taiwan right now.
Yes, perfect parallel.
If one node drops, the entire technological infrastructure of the modern world essentially halts. But wait, let me push back on Jack's Roman math for a second.
Go for it.
So 476 AD is widely cited, but that was only the fall of the Western Roman Empire.
It's true.
The Eastern Roman Empire, centered in Constantinople, maintained its complex bureaucracy, military, and economic system for nearly 1,000 more years, until 1453. So isn't Jack just cherry-picking Western-centric dates to make his neat little 1655-year formula work?
That is a very astute critique. The rigid mathematics of the 1655-year cycle is precisely where any serious historian would totally dismantle Jack's theory.
I knew it.
Civilizational collapse is a chaotic, multi-causal process. It's not a metronome. 1180 BC is merely a median date for a regional breakdown that took decades, sometimes centuries, to unfold. Jack is definitely forcing historical data into a predetermined mathematical template.
So the dates are basically bogus.
The precise dates, yes. However, while his specific timeline is deeply flawed, the mechanisms he describes align strikingly well with established historical cycles.
Like what?
Well, consider Ray Dalio's research on the changing world order and the cycles of empires like the Dutch, the British, and the American empires.
Right. I've read some of Dalio's work. He outlines a very clear macroeconomic cycle. Empires rise on a foundation of strong education, technological innovation, and competitive trade.
Exactly.
But as they mature, they hit the late-stage debt cycle. They take on massive, unserviceable debt to fund global military reach and domestic entitlement programs.
Which sounds a lot like Jack's parasite class and elite feedback loop.
It totally does. When they can no longer service that debt through economic output, the central bank steps in and prints fiat currency to monetize the debt. This inevitably leads to currency debasement, skyrocketing inflation, and massive internal political conflict driven by wealth inequality. Jack's feedback loop sounds identical to Dalio's late-stage debt cycle.
It is functionally the exact same mechanism. And if we look at the internal dynamics of the Roman collapse, we see that exact trajectory of currency debasement.
Really? How did the Romans do it?
The Roman Empire didn't simply succumb to external barbarian invasions, like we often learn in school. It hollowed itself out economically.
Oh, wow.
Over centuries, emperors continually debased the physical currency to fund continuous military expansion and a massive, bloated administrative state. The exact parasite class Jack warned about.
How do you debase physical coins, though?
You reduce the precious metal content. The silver denarius, and later the antonanus, went from being almost pure silver to essentially a base bronze coin covered in a microscopic silver wash.
So they basically destroyed their own money supply to fund the state apparatus.
Yes, and we see the dangers of extreme hyper-specialization in the collapse of the classic Maya civilization around the 9th century, too.
Oh, I've always wondered about the Mayans. What happened there?
The Maya engineered brilliant but incredibly rigid, centralized agricultural and water management systems to support massive urban populations.
Oh, okay.
When severe multi-generational droughts altered the climate patterns, their highly specialized, inflexible infrastructure couldn't adapt. The populace lacked the generalist skills to revert to decentralized foraging or alternative agriculture.
Wow, they were trapped by their own complexity.
Exactly. They starved amidst their own monuments. So Jack's core argument holds up. Complex, hyper-specialized societies trade resilience for efficiency, and when the efficiency breaks, the society dies.
So, synthesizing this, Jack Doyle possessed a genuinely sharp understanding of macroeconomic cycles and systemic fragility.
He really did.
His analysis of currency debasement and supply chain vulnerability was deeply rooted in historical precedent, but his methodology for communicating it was disastrous.
It was a complete disaster. He suffered from a self-diagnosed Cassandra complex.
Cassandra from Greek mythology.
Right. In the myth, Cassandra was granted the gift of prophecy by Apollo, but she was cursed to never be believed. Jack carried the psychological burden of a man who believed he saw the cliff edge approaching with absolute mathematical certainty, yet was surrounded by people happily pressing the accelerator.
And because he felt cursed, he abandoned all subtlety.
Completely.
The source material describes him just shouting at low-level county clerks, telling them to go back to your boss, Soros, and relentlessly ranting about Klaus Schwab and the WEF at municipal meetings.
Yeah, not the best strategy for staying off the radar.
Not at all. I mean, if you are trying to quietly build a resilient, off-grid community, a founder screaming at building inspectors about globalist cabals is a massive operational liability. It draws the exact type of attention you want to avoid.
It was an operational liability that ultimately proved fatal. But while Jack was busy antagonizing local bureaucrats with historical prophecies, the rest of the founders were executing the quiet, methodical work of actually building the infrastructure of San Aurelio.
Right. They moved beyond theoretical philosophy and initiated a campaign of de facto parallel governance. They didn't just build cabins in the woods.
No.
They engineered a legal and economic anomaly within the borders of Florida. So let's dive into the mechanics of how they actually secured the territory. Because they didn't just buy the land outright.
They didn't. Sarah utilized a deeply entrenched, highly specific legal mechanism known as adverse possession.
Adverse possession. Squatters' rights, basically.
Essentially, yes, but very formalized. The town of San Aurelio was a forgotten sugar mill town. It was a wasteland of abandoned paper foreclosures, bankruptcies, and shell companies that hadn't filed taxes in decades.
A ghost town on paper.
Exactly. Adverse possession allows a person to legally claim title to land if they openly occupy it, maintain it, and pay the back taxes on it for a specified period of time.
But it has to meet specific criteria, right?
Yes, the possession must be hostile, actual, open, notorious, exclusive, and continuous.
It's a lot of hurdles.
It is, but Sarah and the community weaponized the state's own property laws to carve out their enclave. They physically rehabilitated the dilapidated structures, mapped the property lines, and walked into the county tax assessor's office to pay the delinquent property taxes, thereby establishing a legally defensible paper trail of occupation.
And they were only able to outmaneuver the county government because of Marcus Lee.
Yes, Marcus was their secret weapon.
Marcus didn't just bring internet access to the swamp, he brought an algorithmic sniper rifle to a bureaucratic knife fight.
That's a great way to put it.
The source text details how Marcus scraped decades of convoluted, poorly digitized county land records, tax liens, zoning ordinances. He built a proprietary parallel relational database that was exponentially faster and more accurate than the county's own legacy software.
So when Sarah interacted with the municipal government, Marcus literally carried the real, uncorrupted data in his backpack.
Exactly. They possessed total informational supremacy over the very clerks trying to regulate them. They basically held a royal flush in a poker game against the local government.
But the true paradigm shift, the mechanism that elevated San Aurelio from an eccentric homesteading collective into a systemic contagion, was their economic engine.
The silver.
Yes. Initially, the community relied on a standard barter system. Sarah traded eggs for Ethan's mechanical repairs. Gabo traded labor for lumber. But barter economies suffer from severe liquidity friction.
Right, the double coincidence of why.
Exactly. It makes complex trade highly inefficient. You can only trade so many goats for architectural blueprints before the fractional math just breaks down. They needed a medium of exchange.
This is where Jack Doyle steps in, dropping a canvas pouch of tarnished pre-1965 U.S. coinage onto the table.
Junk silver.
Quarters, dimes, and half dollars minted before the U.S. removed silver from its circulating coinage. It was a stroke of logistical brilliance. Gabo fully supported the move, pointing out that in Spanish, the word plata literally translates to both silver and money.
It's deeply cultural.
Yeah, the concept of precious metal as the sole legitimate medium of exchange is baked into the linguistic foundation of human trade.
We really need to examine the profound systemic implications of this shift to a junk silver economy. By transacting exclusively in physical silver, they bypassed Gresham's law.
Gresham's law, that's the economic principle that bad money drives out good.
Exactly. In the outside world, people hoard silver and spend depreciating fiat dollars. But inside San Aurelio, fiat was banned. Silver was the only acceptable currency.
Wow.
This allowed them to clear complex, multi-party transactions entirely without a central ledger. There were no digital bank accounts, no credit card processing fees, and crucially, no taxable data trails generated by financial institutions.
I want you to imagine the mechanics of that kind of economic freedom. When you trade physical silver for a service, the transaction is perfectly closed.
It's final.
Yeah. It requires zero trust in a third-party intermediary, zero trust in the Federal Reserve's monetary policy, and it exists completely outside the surveillance architecture of the IRS. It is pure, peer-to-peer human exchange based on the intrinsic weight and purity of a metal. It is the ultimate rejection of the modern financial system.
It is.
But, and here's where it gets really interesting, operating an untraceable hard money economy in the open paints a massive glowing target on your back.
Which brings us to the internal reaction of the state. We have to view this strictly through the lens of institutional risk assessment.
Right. How did the government view this?
The source material provides access to these deeply revealing declassified FOIA memos, internal communication circulating between the Department of Justice, the Treasury Department, and the Department of Homeland Security.
The language in those memos is crazy.
It is highly precise and utterly chilling.
The government didn't care that the residents of San Aurelio were armed. Florida has permissive firearm laws, and the residents hadn't broken any. They didn't care that they were growing heirloom tomatoes or living off the grid.
Not at all.
The specific terminology deployed in the interagency memos focused entirely on the structural threat. Phrases like de facto governance, parallel economic structures, and the most revealing phrase, economic contagion.
To understand why a handful of people trading silver in a swamp triggered a multi-agency federal response, we have to look at the fundamental architecture of state power.
Okay, let's look at it.
A modern nation-state relies on two absolute monopolies to justify its existence: the monopoly on the legitimate use of physical force and the monopoly on the issuance and regulation of currency.
And San Aurelio was bypassing the latter.
Yes, they had structurally bypassed the latter, which intrinsically threatened the state's ability to extract taxation.
It's the threat of the precedent. In one of the transcribed hearings, a Treasury official explicitly outlines the domino effect. If a community can successfully implement a decentralized, untaxable barter and silver economy in Florida, and the federal government allows it to persist, that model becomes an open source blueprint.
It spreads.
Exactly. It spreads to intentional communities in Idaho, Texas, Montana. The tax base erodes, but more importantly, the psychological illusion that the fiat system is mandatory just evaporates.
Precisely. The memos explicitly state that San Aurelio's operational model is incompatible with U.S. law. Not because they were actively committing violent felonies, but because their very survival demonstrated that human flourishing is possible outside the state's financial architecture.
Wow.
The state, by its very nature, cannot permit its own necessity to be empirically disproven. The precedent had to be eradicated.
But wait, if they viewed this community as a literal economic contagion, why the hesitation? Why didn't the DOJ or the FBI just immediately authorize a tactical raid? If they're a threat to the U.S. Treasury, why tolerate Marcus subverting county databases and Jack screaming at local officials for months?
Because the federal agencies were paralyzed by an optic dilemma. The declassified memos are filled with margin notes from agency directors agonizing over public perception.
What kind of notes?
One specific handwritten note reads, "Waco 2.0 must be avoided, but optics. Ruby Ridge and the sun must be avoided too."
Oh, wow. They knew exactly how bad it could look.
They understood that deploying armored vehicles against farmers and tech workers would be a catastrophic public relations disaster. A kinetic raid risked creating highly visible martyrs on live television, which would paradoxically validate every single warning Jack Doyle had issued about state tyranny.
So if a kinetic strike is off the table because of the optics and ignoring them allows the contagion to spread, what is the bureaucratic playbook for destroying a community?
A CIA intelligence memorandum, adapted for domestic risk assessment, provided the consensus strategy. Quote, "Economic strangulation plus reputational attrition. Objective: discredit the model before replication."
That's so calculated.
The state apparatus decided to execute a silent siege. They utilized their vast regulatory power to slowly suffocate San Aurelio logistically, while simultaneously manipulating the media narrative to ensure the broader public would view the community not as pioneers, but as parasites.
Let's look at the mechanics of that strangulation. They didn't build a fence, they used regulatory leverage. Federal and state agencies began heavily auditing the commercial licenses of the independent diesel suppliers who delivered fuel to San Aurelio's generators.
Which is completely legal but highly targeted.
Right. Faced with the threat of losing their Department of Transportation certifications, the suppliers quietly stopped taking Sarah's calls. The state leveraged the complexity of its own bureaucracy to cut the town's logistical lifelines without firing a single shot.
And concurrently, they launched the reputational attrition campaign.
How did they manage that?
Well, in the early days of San Aurelio, local media coverage was actually benign, even supportive. The Immokalee Chronicle ran a piece titled "Homesteaders or Outlaws," featuring quotes from local feed store owners who appreciated the new business.
So they were well-liked locally.
Yes, the community was viewed as a collection of eccentric but harmless neighbors. However, as federal interest intensified, the national media narrative abruptly shifted. The coverage transformed from human interest pieces about off-grid farming to alarmist segments about heavily armed, tax-dodging sects and cyber squatter fantasies.
But the weapon that truly destroyed San Aurelio's public image was the myth of the gold vault.
Yes.
And the tragic irony is that Marcus and Jack accidentally handed the federal government the exact narrative wedge they needed. Marcus, operating an anonymous tech account, posted a theoretical thread drawing parallels between cryptographic security and precious metals. He wrote, "Hard money is better stored in the ground than in servers. Both crash, but only one survives fire."
He was engaging in an abstract debate about systemic resilience and digital attack surfaces.
Exactly. But nuance does not survive the internet, nor does it survive intelligence gathering. The internet took Marcus's metaphor literally, and Jack, entirely unable to suppress his Cassandra complex, dumped gasoline on the fire.
Oh, Jack couldn't help himself.
When county inspectors or law enforcement would arrive to harass the perimeter, Jack would confront them screaming, "Tell your masters we're not funding their little WEF wet dream," and making aggressive, cryptic boasts about the Federal Reserve never getting their hands on the community's gold.
I thought he was projecting strength.
Yeah, but he was actually providing probable cause.
The source text maps how this rumor mutated. It went from campfire speculation among locals to local radio broadcasts and finally to national cable news segments.
It just snowballed.
Completely. The pundits weren't discussing the philosophical merits of a parallel economy. They were obsessing over a mythical dragon's hoard of illicit, untaxed wealth buried beneath the swamp. And here is where we see the terrifying epistemology of bureaucracy.
What do you mean by that?
A low-level intelligence analyst monitoring the media coverage wrote a speculative, handwritten memo about potential hidden assets and illicit financial activity. Once that speculative note was typed into an official DHS threat assessment, it crossed the bureaucratic event horizon.
It became real.
Exactly. It ceased to be a rumor and officially became an actionable fact within the government's internal logic.
The rumor of the buried vault was the perfect wedge for the state's strategy of reputational attrition. It completely stripped San Aurelio of its philosophical purity. In the eyes of the American public, they were no longer principled idealists constructing a resilient alternative to a corrupt system. They were framed as greedy, heavily armed hoarders actively defrauding the taxpayer.
By painting them as common criminals hoarding gold, the state successfully manufactured the public consent required to justify incoming violence.
It's a devastating self-fulfilling prophecy. The foundational goal of San Aurelio was to be left entirely alone, to quietly exit the system. But Jack's aggressive, performative baiting of the state, colliding with Marcus's cryptic digital footprint, fed directly into a media and bureaucratic machine hungry for a villain.
They basically built a beacon in the swamp, broadcasting their exact coordinates to the very forces they were trying to escape.
Right. It is a profound demonstration of how both actors catalyzed the final tragedy. The centralized state required a villain to justify crushing a dangerous systemic precedent, and Jack Doyle's psychological need to be proven right compelled him to audition for the role.
And the strategy of economic strangulation began to critically weaken the community's cohesion. Stripped of diesel fuel, isolated by law enforcement perimeters, and subjected to relentless media demonization, families began quietly abandoning the project in the middle of the night.
And the state escalated to psychological warfare, didn't they?
They did. The tactical teams utilized nighttime spotlighting. They parked armored vehicles on the perimeter roads and directed high-powered industrial spotlights directly into the residential cabins all night long.
That's literal torture.
The sheer psychological toll of sleep deprivation, combined with the constant looming threat of an armed raid, just fractured the community's resolve. The stage was set for the climax.
So what actually triggered the final raid?
The final raid was inevitably triggered by a highly ambiguous, aggressively manufactured pretext. A murky altercation involving a delivery truck on a county road adjacent to the property provided the agencies with the necessary justification to claim paramilitary activity.
So they found their excuse.
Exactly. The optic concerns were discarded, the tactical vehicles breached the perimeter, and in the ensuing chaos, the post office, which the community had converted into their central trading post and the physical repository for their silver ledger, caught fire.
The source text contains harrowing testimonies from the survivors who maintain to this day that the smell of kerosene was thick in the air before the fire started. The destruction of the post office was the destruction of San Aurelio's economic heart. The community was entirely scattered. Dozens of residents were arrested on a myriad of regulatory and conspiracy charges.
The legal aftermath was equally brutal. Marcus Lee, the brilliant architect of their digital infrastructure, was placed on the witness stand during the federal trial.
They squeezed him
hard, facing decades in federal prison for cybercrimes related to his database scraping. He was forced by the prosecution to systematically disavow Jack Doyle and the entire ideological foundation of the community just to secure a plea deal.
That's tragic.
The physical structures of San Aurelio were reduced to ash and reclaimed by the Everglades. And the community passed into internet folklore, immortalized merely as a meme of a rusted bell tower facing down a line of armored vehicles.
So, as we evaluate this entire narrative, we have to address the core systemic question. Did decentralization fail? Did the fiery destruction of San Aurelio definitively prove that Jack Doyle's vision of surviving the 1655-year cycle is impossible? Is a decentralized safeguard against macroeconomic collapse fundamentally unworkable?
No, it does not prove the concept is unworkable.
Huh.
But it vividly exposed a fatal architectural flaw in San Aurelio's specific execution.
What was the flaw?
They possessed brilliant, highly functional decentralized concepts. They successfully implemented a peer-to-peer silver exchange. They utilized open-source data scraping to outmaneuver bureaucratic control, and they distributed critical agricultural and mechanical skills among the population.
What went wrong?
They tethered all of those resilient, decentralized concepts to a highly centralized, static physical location, a town, a single fixed coordinate on a map.
And geography is the ultimate single point of failure. If you concentrate your people, your silver, and your infrastructure within a defined physical perimeter, you present the state with a physical attack surface.
Yes, exactly.
A town can be surrounded. Its supply lines can be severed by revoking commercial driving licenses. It can be subjected to acoustic and psychological warfare. And ultimately, its physical structures can be burned to the ground.
Marcus Lee realized this profound tactical error in the aftermath. If the goal is to build a resilient safeguard against a sprawling, heavily armed, centralized state, concentrating your assets in a 19th century physical model is a fatal miscalculation.
It's just too vulnerable.
True systemic decentralization must be both digital and geographically distributed. You can roll an armored Bearcat up to a rusted water tower in Florida, but you cannot physically raid a distributed global network of individuals transacting autonomously across multiple jurisdictions.
It's the difference between building a fortress and building a network. The fortress always falls eventually, but a network simply routes around the damage.
From the perspective of a historian evaluating systemic risk, San Aurelio functions as an early, tragic prototype.
Like the Wright brothers, almost.
Precisely. Much like the early pioneers of aviation who crashed spectacularly before the physics of aerodynamics were fully understood, San Aurelio is a flawed but vital attempt to engineer a life outside the fragility of the fiat system. Their physical vulnerability led to their destruction.
But the state's reaction speaks volumes, doesn't it?
It does. The sheer magnitude of the state's reaction, the mobilization of multi-agency task forces, the orchestrated media manipulation, and the immense expenditure of resources to crush a few dozen families trading silver Gaunet, empirically proves that the centralized state fundamentally agrees with San Aurelio's premise.
Which is?
Decentralized living is a highly viable existential threat to central authority.
Let's recap the sheer scale of this journey. We started by examining the quiet systemic failures that drove an organic farmer, a disillusioned soldier, a Cuban immigrant, and a Silicon Valley defector to seek accountability outside the system.
We covered a lot of ground.
We really did. We analyzed Jack Doyle's rigid 1655-year math, cross-examining his theories of systemic fragility and currency debasement against the late Bronze Age collapse and the fall of the Roman Empire. We watched this group weaponize adverse possession laws and scrap county databases to carve out a legally ambiguous sanctuary.
And the economics of it all.
Right, we dissected the exact mechanics of how their junk silver economy bypassed the fiat system and how the federal government, terrified of the precedent, deployed economic strangulation and media manipulation to systematically crush them.
It remains a profound, meticulously documented case study on the absolute limits of operational freedom within the borders of a modern centralized nation-state, and is a fascinating real-world stress test of historical theories regarding civilizational cycles and systemic fragility.
Which leaves us with one final, incredibly provocative thought to consider. Jack Doyle, our abrasive modern Cassandra, predicted with absolute mathematical certainty that the next great civilizational collapse will occur in the year 2130.
Around 2130, yeah.
Right. And his core argument was that this collapse would be driven by the elite's desperate feedback loops, their relentless, heavy-handed interventions to maintain centralized control as the system rots from within.
The irony is pretty thick there.
It is, because if we applied Jack's theory to the fate of his own community, what if the federal government's orchestrated destruction of San Aurelio is the exact feedback loop he was warning about? The state utilized massive force to crush a localized experiment in self-reliance, burning down an alternative hard money economy simply to protect the absolute dominance of their fragile fiat system.
It's a haunting thought.
What if, by actively hunting down, criminalizing, and destroying the very people who are practicing the generalized survival skills and decentralized economics necessary to weather a systemic shock, the centralized system is actively guaranteeing its own inevitable catastrophic collapse? You can burn down a physical town in the Everglades, but you cannot burn down the mathematical reality of a failing system. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.